I'm going to let everyone in. Whenever you're ready, Kim.
Perfect. Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are, to everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this important convening, Public Service Under Pressure, Understanding the Impact of Recent Actions, and Reimagining the Future of Workforce Excellence. I'm Kimberly Walton. I'm a fellow and board member of the National Academy of Public Administration. Before retiring from federal service, I served as an executive across multiple agencies. And it's an honor to moderate today's discussion. And I want to note that I serve as co-chair of the Public Service Standing Panel alongside my colleague, Sarah Mogilescu. Today, we are committed to lifting up, together we are committed to lifting up timely issues like today's topic. In recent months, federal executive orders, departmental restructuring, hiring freezes, and funding cuts have created turbulence across all levels of government. As elements of the federal workforce shrink or shift, communities feel the ripples. In basic services, grant continuity, intergovernmental coordination, and perhaps most critically, trust in government institutions. And as we all know, the federal government shut down at midnight on September 30th, underscoring just how fragile our systems can be under pressure. Our purpose today is to examine how these top-down decisions are landing in localities, states, and agencies, and to surface ideas and strategies for sustaining a mission-driven public sector in unsettled times. I'm honored to be joined by an extraordinary group of accomplished leaders and thinkers whose experiences span federal, state, local government, and academic and nonprofit sectors. Together, they bring the insight we need to diagnose the present moment and chart a course forward. The panelists are Abby Andre, Executive Director of Impact Project, a data-driven platform that visualizes how federal employment funding and policy changes ripple into communities. Abby, a former Department of Justice attorney and current doctoral researcher, has dedicated her work to connecting national decisions with local realities. We're also joined by Chris Kaliba, the Edwin O. Steen Distinguished Professor at the University of Kansas, whose scholarship centers on governance networks, resilience, and complex systems. Chris has long bridged academia and practice, developing engagement labs that bring public servants and communities together. Also, Vince McCone, a seasoned federal executive and former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Operations at the United States Department of Labor. Vince brings firsthand expertise in federal workforce management, operations, and leaderships in times of shifting priorities. Tanisha Briley is a city manager of Gaithersburg, Maryland. Tanisha has led municipal operations in a rapidly growing and diverse community, ensuring fiscal sustainability, high quality service delivery, and effective partnerships across levels of government. And finally, Michael Jacobson, who's the Deputy Director for Performance Strategy and Budget in King County, Washington. Michael has pioneered approaches to align outcomes, analytics, and resource allocation at the county level, strengthening how local governments respond to disruption. We also are joined by NAPA's Brenna Eisman, who will close today's session with reflections and next steps. So the flow I would like to follow is Abby will begin with an overview of the Impact Project tool and its insights. We'll then turn to Chris Kaliba for the big picture governance perspective. Next, Vince McCone will share federal government insights. Following Vince, we'll hear from Tanisha Briley at the city level and then Michael Jacobson at the county level. And we'll finally open up to conversation and Q&As followed by the closing. With that, let me turn it over to Abby.
Thank you so much, Kim. And thank you for having me today. I'm really pleased to be with this group of leaders who are thinking about where we go from here. So I'm going to take just about 10 minutes to overview the Impact Project, which is a nonpartisan data and research initiative that I started in February in response to the change we were seeing flow out of the administration. And the main goal here was to gather data from diverse sources, and I'll talk a little bit about what we have, so that localities could begin to understand the local impact of government change. Because rapid government change here has really thrown communities, local and state governments, businesses, philanthropies, foundations, nonprofits, and people into uncertainty. And so we need tools in this moment to understand what's been lost and to understand how we can rebuild and reimagine from here. So just a minute first about why the Impact Project. As Kim mentioned, I was a federal prosecutor for about a decade in the environmental enforcement section, and I actually think some of my former colleagues are here on the call with us today. And that really instilled in me a great respect for our government institutions and for public servants in particular. From there, I taught at Vermont Law School and ran their environmental advocacy clinic, and now I'm getting a PhD in environmental sociology. So for me, from a personal perspective, the why is that I've spent my career studying the law and government institutions and how they intersect with our communities. And in February, I began to look for a tool to try to ground understanding for friends and families across the country who don't have our expertise and experience, who didn't understand how integrated federal dollars are into so many of our essential community services. Why else? An unprecedented scope and scale of change. So over the past 9 months, we've seen change in every state, every county in the country, whether that's through workforce reductions, grant or contract cancellations, or the ripple effect of those things. There's really been no corner of the country, and thinking more globally, many places around the globe left unimpacted by the unprecedented amount of change. Hundreds of thousands of civil servants have separated from the government, and those numbers are not fully updated to include the DRP that expired yesterday and the rifts that might come during the shutdown. And we also have seen a huge erasure of federal data, particularly environmental data. Since the beginning of this administration, over 110,000 government websites have gone dark. So all of these things taken in combination created this urgent need to archive data, preserve data, and begin to create an archive of government change. And that's what we've done here. So the Impact Project at its core archives what we've lost, but is really beginning to use that data, ground it in underlying socioeconomic and environmental data, and create tools for leaders to be able to figure out what to do next. Where are there persistent gaps in our public service ecosystem? Where have contracts and grants been canceled? Where do we need to step in as leaders to think really creatively now about how to replace services that have been traditionally performed by the federal government, but for the next 3 years at least, won't be? So getting a little bit into the data and the database that we're building, we've so far collected about 125,000 instances of government change. So what does that look like? How do we do that? Our database is a mixed methods database. We've collected qualitative data through interviews and surveys, quantitative data through government platforms and government databases that are still available, as well as archived databases. So many of the websites that you could have accessed in December of last year have now been archived, which is very typical in an administration shift. But what we don't see as often is a loss of data when that happens. So we are pulling government data both down from live sites and archived sites. In addition to these instances of government change that we collect through government data, interviews, and also newspaper articles, we have about 50,000 of those. We have hundreds of thousands of baseline data points. So what do I mean by baseline data? Data only means something if you put it in the context of the ecosystem that you're thinking about. So if you're thinking about St. Louis and the impacts of changes of government on St. Louis, you need to understand who lives there, what industries are there, what are the challenges that they were facing before these new shifts happen. And if you can't do that, it's really difficult to understand the impact of a single change, let alone the cumulative impact of changes across sectors. So each of our maps, and increasingly the database that we're building, reflects a lot of external sources: census data, BLS data, data that you used to be able to access through tools like the EJ screen at EPA, FEMA's Disaster Risk Index. We've folded all of that into our databases so that in the future, when we're creating tools where you can build your own maps, build your own tools, you are querying the database not only for the change data that we've collected ourselves, but also the baseline data that you need to understand what that change might mean for your communities. So right now we have 4 interactive maps, and we are building more all the time. They touch on changes to public health, changes to AmeriCorps, because we partnered with them very early as a program partner, so we could map the 35,000 or so service locations that they have across the country. Our overarching map, which is sector-wide, which includes changes in agriculture, energy and environment, law enforcement, anything that you can think of that the federal government might do, we've been tracking in that big map. And then the last one that's particularly relevant for this week is we are tracking budget and overlaying it with the locations across the country where people work for certain programs. So when you go in to look at our office and budget map, you'll see all of the locations that we've scraped from government agency websites where people work for the Farm Service Agency or the DOJ or HHS, overlaid with budget information that is as up to date as we have. So you'll see the president's budget and how that changed from 2025 to this year, the House committee reports, the Senate committee reports, and we will track it down to the dollar and to the FTE, the full-time equivalent change suggested by the agencies when we finally have a government that is open and running again, so that you, as an individual leader in a geographically specific location, can see where federal officials may have been fired and how the dollars flowing to those places may have changed. We also have a significant number of partners that we're working with: the Data Science Institute out of UChicago, National Council of Nonprofits, to name a few. I'm not going to get too deeply into the methodology and process. It's a real balance of the academic rigor that my team and I are trained in and the need for speed right now to create tools for you all to use. So how do we do this and how do you use it? Our new climate and energy tool is the one that I'm going to demo briefly today. But what you see whenever you come into any of our maps are different layers of data that you can add. The middle, the dots, those are government change instances. So you can here look at IRA grants that have been canceled, community resilience and disaster grants that have been pulled down, individual impacts to farmers, communities, so on. You can overlay that with the red socioeconomic data, racial makeup of a particular community. And then new with the climate and energy tool, we have environmental data. So it will tell you which communities are suffering from an unusual amount of heat and will continue to as the climate changes, or how much pollution or particulate matter, PM2, right, is in the air in a particular place. And that again allows you, before we have the time to do the longitudinal studies needed to ground this change in academic rigor and peer review, it allows you to get a view into who might need help right away in your communities. So for example, if you go to our climate and energy map, which will be live next week, and zoom into Dallas, this is the heat profile of that community, overlaid with the socioeconomic profile of that community, and finally, individual instances of government change. So the last slide here, how can this data be used? We already talked about it being an archive, a record for what has been lost, but we really want to figure out how best to provide this data to you as you envision a different version of the future for you and the communities that you represent. How do you make sure the people in your communities have what they need in the short term and in the long term? How do you crisis plan for folks who've lost access to dollars to pay heating and cooling bills, or food pantry as we come up on the winter months? But then how also do we as communities think really critically about how to collect data moving forward, have sovereignty over it, and protect our public services so that they're more immune to political change in the future? So I'm going to leave it there in respect for our time and just say thank you again so much for having me here. And I really appreciate being part of this conversation.
Thank you, Abby. First, thank you for even taking this on. As you mentioned, in many federal websites, information that I used to rely on is no longer available, and it's nice to know that it is. So I can still find it someplace. I'm going to turn it now to Chris Kaliba, who is going to talk to us about the big picture of governance. Chris?
Thank you, Kimberly. And thanks to NAPA for organizing this, and thanks to the public service sector standing panel for organizing. You know, one of the things I think to take away from Abby's work, and hopefully what I'm going to say now, is that the good news is that the field is organizing, and sometimes it's taking some heroic efforts, folks like Abby. But there's also a role for our institutions, particularly our academic institutions, to play in addressing the crisis of the moment. What I'm going to talk briefly about is the Accountability and Reform Research Consortium, what we're calling ARC. And I want to ask one of my colleagues from the Volcker Alliance to put in the chat some links to the website of ARC that was just launched. We developed ARC as a response to build institutions to better coordinate research around some of the pressing, bigger questions of the day. ARC is a cross-university research collaborative formed to deliver rigorous and timely research on the impact of the cuts, particularly starting with the federal government workforce and the downstream effects they have on public service delivery and on citizens and communities across the country. ARC is going to be co-chaired by the Volcker Alliance, and thank you, Sarah Mogilescu, for your leadership in helping to launch this, and myself and my colleague, Bill Resch. Bill is a professor and chair in the Department of Public Management and Policy at Georgia State University, and we will be having what we anticipate is many other academic and policy experts joining us in this endeavor. ARC's efforts are designed to cultivate collaborative research, incentivize investigations of priority research questions. And I should say that the present moment is really pressing and stressing the academic community to ask different questions, or to expand questions to include some of the challenges that we're seeing here today. Many of the things we'll talk about later, I am sure. It's to produce timely and accessible research. And we're going to do this through a combination of creating interdisciplinary, what we're calling communities of practice, online, virtual working groups, combined with incentivized resources to create and generate publications, white papers, policy briefs, peer-reviewed pieces, podcasts and webinars, and also to work with folks like Abby and her colleagues on cultivating and curating transparent open source data sets. The big questions, Kim said, I previewed that I was going to ask some of the bigger questions. Well, we've organized and identified 4 pillars that are going to pivot around, and these will evolve over time, no doubt. But the first one is, and it's pointing to the major crisis we're having in the federal civil service right now. And this first pillar is focused on workforce and expertise. The vitality of a federal workforce and the expertise embedded in it is a foundation and foundational to our capacity to lead and effectively administrate democratic governance. But personnel are not just simply line items and budgets. They also embody skills, institutional memory, and professional norms that allow our agencies to carry out their missions. We're going to be asking some big questions, among others. What is the scope of recent workforce reductions, and how does the size and composition of the workforce compare historically over time? Which agencies' capacities and functions have been most impacted by personnel cuts, and what are the downstream effects on program outcomes? You can begin to see that what we're doing by focusing and harnessing energies and trying to attract academics and policy analysts who know the federal workforce the best. We want to get the best minds and brightest to be able to focus on some of these core questions. The second pillar is perhaps the biggest, big questions we're asking, and it has to do with the capacity to govern in a democratic society. The capacity of democratic institutions deliver public services, they regulate markets, and they uphold accountability standards that depend on a resilient administrative state. And when they are subject to drastic politically motivated disruptions, its ability to fulfill these mandates, the democratically anchored mandates, is weakened and potentially substantially transformed. And so we'll be asking questions like, how is the administrative capacity of governments operating under the pretext of liberal democracies as opposed to non-liberal democratic ones operationalized? And is there some standardization in the classification of terms and constructs in order to measure and document administrative capacity and when it's depleted? The third pillar will be focusing on what we're calling the downstream effects, and many of those effects are being captured in Abby's impact project, for example. Depleted administrative capacity and the risk of political capture have downstream effects, both intergovernmentally to our states and local governments, and we're going to hear from colleagues about this very shortly, as well as intersectorally across to our nonprofit colleagues and also to our for-profit service providers and contractors. Intergovernmental impacts concern the shifting of service delivery and regulatory responsibility from the federal government to states, counties, and localities. And how is that happening, and what are the challenges therein? And does the signal of the deconstruction of the federal government signal a further privatization of traditionally publicly derived public goods and services? We're going to be asking questions like, what are the short and long-term impacts of government restructuring and deconstructing on service delivery across the federal, state, and local governments and the nonprofit sectors? The fourth and final pillar that we're going to launch, and we're going to launch all of these and have them up and running by the end of the winter. We already have the first workforce and expertise pillar up and running, and we're going to have the capacity pillar up and running likely in November. Is data and analytical infrastructure. The ability to democratic institutions to justify their actions depends on transparent, accessible, and resilient databases and reliable databases. And data systems allow governments to monitor activities, justify decisions, and provide evidence to sustain legitimacy. Yet, longstanding norms of data siloing, limited sharing, and restricted access have weakened our capacity to track and evaluate government operations. And as Abby mentioned, we're seeing basically the undermining and the undermining of our data infrastructure for government. So we're losing whole data sets and whole capacity of government to measure these things. So we're going to be asking larger questions like, what are the ideal data systems architecture that is needed to provide for more of a comprehensive picture of administrative capacity? And what kind of ontology can we develop and use this crisis as an opportunity to reinvigorate a next generation, a new generation of democratically anchored data infrastructure. So just to put a final pitch then, please take a look at the website, and there are interest forms. We are collecting names and your interest in areas of activity. We want to thank some of the pioneering foundational policy schools that have kicked in resources. So they're putting skin in the game to make this happen and help to take it off the ground. And please look for that list there. And please consider adding yours if you're from one of the policy schools across the country. And I'm happy to chime in as we go along. But thank you, Kim, for inviting me. And I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
And thank you, Chris, for teeing up those four pillars. And it's a perfect transition to Vince McCone, because when you talk about workforce and expertise, what we commonly refer to in the government is brain drain, and thinking about the massive changes that have happened in the federal workforce and this huge outflux of feds. We still don't know the downstream effects, but I'm going to turn it over to Vince McCone, who has many, many years in the federal government, to provide a federal government insight.
Thank you very much, Kim. And it's a pleasure to be on the panel with so many distinguished colleagues, and also to see so many friends and colleagues joining us today on a Friday. Abby, I very much appreciate the work that you're doing to share information about how impacts may affect the intergovernmental structure of how we provide services in our country. And I think it's important to have a framework of when one part of our government changes, how it has downstream impacts on other sectors, so that we can best be resilient in our responses to that. And also, Chris, I appreciate the role that schools of public affairs and public administration are going to take in looking at understanding what we need to do in the future based on some of the titanic shifts in government that we're having. My entire time in government, I cannot remember a time when the federal government was not under pressure. So I started in the 1990s, and I remember full well what we had with the Hammer Awards and the first go at reinventing government, and the loss of the talent through that entire process and the shifts and changes. Then I, like many of you, experienced 9/11, and again, a shift in government operations, in entire structures of how we work together as many government entities. Then, of course, we had the financial collapse and sequestration, which had other impacts on the federal government and our ability to grow and meet mission requirements the way that we wanted. Again, we're in a shutdown. I was in every shutdown since 1990, and they have a debilitating impact on the morale of your workforce, even if they know that they will be paid. People who are in public service want to work. And when they're not able to execute their mission, and when there's uncertainty, it creates challenges for workforces to meet on those. And of course, all of that combined sort of reflects what we've been through with the DOGE changes during the past year to the status of the federal government. And look, I will tell you, changing the size of one of the portions of our government is something that legislators and executives do. And what we do as public administrators is respond to that. But the path of change that we've experienced this year, with the significant increase in the time of how that's happening, is having huge impacts that we're all very well aware of and that are being documented. The question that I've been asked to is where we go from here. But I did want to first lay out the scenario that, at least during my time in the federal government, it feels like there have been fewer times when it's not been rapidly changing in ways that created unique challenges for leadership and for our workforces. And one thing I will also point to is that I think that what we're experiencing now is not going to change. And I think the AI and how that's going to transform how we provide services is going to create even more destabilizing risks for how we meet the public's needs through our service at the federal, state, local levels. So I think from the federal sector, what we're seeing is longitudinal change in how people viewed their careers. Traditionally, you would look to the federal government as a safe, stable way to have an entire career, perhaps working at one agency. I think those days were waning, and I think they're over at this point. And so that's going to have consequences for how we prepare people who are coming into government service. Because the expectation sets are going to be very different. I believe in many circumstances, the protections that were relied upon for generations of employees are going to be changed. We can talk about whether that's good or bad. I'm just reflecting on what I really think is going to be happening and how we need to prepare for that. So what we need to do, I think, and some of the coping strategies that have been successful in the past that may be useful at this time is to think about resilience in how we deliver on what we do deliver. And resilience involves working in an intergovernmental framework. So if you work, for example, in emergency response, more than ever before, there's going to be intergovernmental dependencies that we need to, as public administrators, focus on in trying to meet those delivered services to our citizens. I think within the federal government, with the reductions, we need to look at how we do the business of government more effectively. It is now time, with the numbers of people who have taken the DRP or otherwise left government, for mission support activities, we need to look more to enterprise management, more to shared services, so that we can support frontline missions and support those people who are doing the day-to-day work by doing what we do more efficiently. And this is something I've fought for in my entire career. Why do we have in one agency 4 or 5 different HR shops when we could have one and use then the frontline employees more effectively and have less back-end activity that we're doing, taking FTEs away from those critical roles when we're in a declining state of budget for how we're going to meet our mission, particularly on the federal level. And we need to continue to have flexible workforce strategies to the extent we can to take care of our workforces with every tool that we have available to us. If remote work is not possible for some employees, what are the other things that we can do to expose them to opportunities for growth through rotations, through temporary details, to really provide them different opportunities to grow and develop? So in sum, what we're seeing now to me is not even the end of the beginning of the changes that we're going to see in governance. What concerns me most right now is someone with federal experience and time is that the nature of our community and our nation is that we are so fragmented that we're not gathering the information that we need to understand to be healthy participants in democracy. I think Chris talked about that. All of us, to make a democracy work, need to understand some fundamental points about what we want our government to be and what's going on and what the impacts are. And so our challenge as public administrators also is to feed facts when and where we can within the environments that we have, and look to academia and to researchers to help us think through and communicate more effectively with the public. I don't think we got to this position in a vacuum. For some reason, many people in our country don't believe government is serving them the way it should. And if that is the case, we need to understand the perception, because I don't believe that's all the reality, period. In fact, I think government does a noble job of doing things that people don't understand that we do every single day to make their lives better. So it's on us to figure out how we can better articulate the impact of what we're doing through the tools you've heard about, through panels like this, and through other opportunities. Thank you. I will turn it back to you, Kim, for colleagues on the state and local levels.
Thank you so much. So as we move to city, county, state level, that's really where, as I say, the rubber meets the road, and the impacts are real. And when I think about their capacity, and as Chris said, the downstream effects of this shift and this disruption. So I'm going to start off with Tanisha Briley, who is at the city level, to speak.
Thank you, Kim, and thanks to the other distinguished panelists. It's Not an exciting topic per se, but it's exciting to be here with all of you. And welcome to everyone who was waiting for us to have all the answers for you. Just stay to the end, and we'll check the try and check the box. No, really, I'm looking forward to the discussion, right? We are all in this boat, rowing together. Since we're sticking with the stream analogy, certainly there's nothing more downstream than the city, right? We're at the end and we're going to catch all of it. And one of the things that I'm concerned about, and we've discussed it as a panel, is, you know, our residents, as Vince just said, right? Civic education isn't at the top of the list anymore. Most Americans don't understand the true impacts of the shift at the federal level and how that's going to change service delivery at every level of government. And what we want to start to talk about and think about is, yes, in the moment, resilience is needed. But going forward, right, this feels different than some of the other shifts that we've experienced. There are unique elements here that feel more permanent. And if that's the case, as government service delivery shifts at the federal level, how do we then respond at the local level? And so thinking about the services that we're responsible for and what's most important to residents, like any crises, right, revenue starts to suffer right at the same time that the demand for services are going to increase. The other thing that we often experience at the local level is that shared revenue that we all depend on so desperately for infrastructure, for public health services, for social services. It's gone away, or it's been redirected, but it doesn't appear that it's coming back our way. And those are the on the ground day-to-day needs that we're going to encounter, and we won't have the revenue for it. I talked about in the past the tools that we had at the local level, particularly as city managers and finance and budget folks. If it were temporary, you could maybe have a discussion with your community about the need for a small tax increase so that you can take on, raise some revenue that may be disappearing at the state level, right? So typically states share revenue with cities to take care of certain services, and you might could get away with that for a bit. It's an easier argument to frame that the state has made this shift because their budget was tight, and they're not giving us those dollars any longer, and therefore we need to increase taxes a bit on our end so that we can take care of these things. That doesn't feel like an adequate tool or approach, right, for the time that we're in, for lots of reasons. One, the fairness of it, we could debate until we're blue in the face. Those tax dollars have left our community, and some portion of them used to come back. Now none of them may come back. And is it fair? Does it make sense to raise rates on residents at this time? Can you even raise rates on residents at this time? So I'm in Gaithersburg, Maryland. I'm in the capital region, where 12% of our workforce are federal employees or contractors. The closer you get to DC, the higher that percentage is for local communities and counties surrounding the district. Raising taxes to have additional revenue, raising fees for additional revenue, is not really going to be a good option at all. So we've got increased needs. We'll have a lot less revenue, and we'll have, I think, more services that we're responsible for that we've never been before. And I think we have temporarily been able to meet that moment. Chris talked about in our prep call, and I appreciated that, Chris. This is sort of a political pandemic, if you will. And the difference there, though, is during the pandemic, I think local governments were able to rise to the occasion, take on some of the services that we perhaps didn't do before, but we had the resources to do it, right? We did receive resources from the federal government to step into those gaps. So, how do we retool to do that. And I think there are going to be some very challenging discussions as we go forward with our communities around what services won't happen, right? And maybe permanently so. And then what happens to that that need? The need doesn't go away. What happens in those situations? I think you'll hear more from Michael on the county level. You know, obviously, county being much more responsible for social service delivery, and those are the real needs that you see day in and day out. But there are, you know, Gaithersburg is fortunate. We aren't that reliant on federal resources. But some of my colleagues in cities across the country are making really hard choices, signing on the dotted line for grant dollars, trading values that their communities hold dearly so that they can get runways repaired at their airports, right? So that these major infrastructure project that's already underway that they had dollars promised for can go forward. And I think as difficult as it may be initially for residents to understand this trickle down impact, this sort of downstream impact, I don't think we'll come out of this thing less civically engaged or educated than we were going in, because we're going to have to find ways to better explain that and partner in new ways that we haven't before to try and really isolate what are we going to focus on and how are we going to deal with the services that we can actually just no longer provide because the resources just aren't there. So preserving service delivery, you know, it's not possible for us to take everything on. And I think that we haven't, you know, whether you're talking about MPA programs to our training programs and how we even talk about local government service delivery, we've always talked about doing more with less. And I think maybe we've done ourselves a disservice over the years with that. We're going to have truer conversations around doing less with less. And really from community to community, I think the prioritization of what those services are going to be is going to depend on the needs of that community. And those may even shift over time, but I think we all have to prepare for those kinds of discussions with the community and with our governing bodies so that we can do our best to meet this moment.
Thank you, Tanisha. I mean, and also pointing out that there's almost a double impact for your community in Gaithersburg, as you have a large number of federal employees at the same time coming out of the workforce for various reasons while you're still dealing with all of the impact. So now let's move it to the West Coast, where Michael Jacobson at the county level will speak to the downstream impacts of this shift. Michael?
Thanks, Kimberly, and thanks to everyone for setting up this topic. I feel like I'm supposed to be batting cleanup now and trying to take us home. So, and thank you for everyone for coming today to listen to these different perspectives. I'm here representing a county. I'm not even representing the county. I've got my logo up, and I've been here for 23 years, so I have some county perspective. But I think one county over could be quite different, even from where I am. I think I guess I just want to focus on people. The people that are actually going to be most affected are our residents. I'm a proud bureaucrat. I have great sympathy for people losing their government positions, but it'd be one thing if we're losing those positions and improving services. It'd be one thing if we're losing those positions, those redundant HR positions that Vince talked about, for example, so that we were putting more dollars into services that people were to receive. But that's not what's happening. We are losing services that are affecting people directly. We're losing AIDS programs. We're losing SNAP programs. We're losing money for homeless people and homeless services. So the impact, even though we're far away, we're not as far as Guam and Hawaii, but we're, you know, a lot of people in my county don't think about the federal government all that much, although we have a lot of federal employment as well. We have military bases and regional headquarters of EPA and things like that. They tend to think of the other Washington the Beltway, Washington, as not really affecting them. But the reality is a tremendous amount of money that comes from our residents in the form of taxes, goes to DC, goes through the process, and has historically come back to us. That's not the case. Abby's map we're a hot spot. We're not as hot as Tanisha, but in terms of how many dots are on our map, but we have quite a few dots. And entire programs have been reliant on these federal dollars. The other thing that I've learned over the years working in the budget office, but not on the budget, is that our budget is not a single pot of money like a household budget is. Our budget is made up of 110 different funds. We have levies for the Parks Division. We have levies for mental health services. We have levies for veterans. We have levies for Best Starts for Kids. Those are our safe zone. Those are specific additional taxes we've asked our community to support, and we live in a wealthy, highly educated community, and so people have generally said yes to those things. The part of our funds that are most vulnerable are our general funds. Those are the ones that are flexible. And right now, something like 85% of our general fund budget is going to feed the criminal legal system. So prosecutors, defenders, judges, the jail, the sheriff, that's where 85% of our money that we have flexibility is going to. So when the federal government says you don't have money for an AIDS program, we're not always able to come back and say, oh, we have a lot of flexibility to cover that. That program is basically gone. The budget, the county executive's proposed budget did just get sent over to our county council. And there was a commitment to maintain some essential services that are losing federal funding. Basic things that everyone would assume the federal government has interest in, things like emergency management. We're having to fund 11 positions in our emergency management office. There's money to nonprofits that are working on youth and adult homeless prevention. And there's Workforce and Innovation Opportunity Act funds that support people to getting GEDs and maintaining work experience and gaining work experience. We're also using some resources to backfill one-time COVID funding. A lot of that's around homelessness services and also gun violence prevention. Again, these are things that there's historically been strong federal government support for. And then that support increased dramatically under COVID. As Tanisha was highlighting, we were able to do amazing things. Really proud of what we did during COVID. But nonetheless, the infusion of federal money made many of those things possible. One strategy that our executive has been taking and the budget office has been taking is basically to establish reserves. So we put $31 million into a reserve to safeguard, to give money to our Harborview Medical Center for people that are going to just basically walk off the street because they don't have health insurance anymore. We also put $8 million into in the Mental Health and Drug Dependency Fund as contingency against federal cuts to behavioral health services. There's also additional shelter services that we're supporting. So that's this year. That's this biennium. We have a approximately $20 billion biennial budget. So it's not small, but it's also not sustainable. Yes, it's balanced this year. We have a state requirement that we have to always do a balanced budget here. But I would say that the cost pressures continue to go up. The service demand, as Tanisha highlighted, are continuing to go up. So those are some of the frontline things that we're feeling here. And we're a relatively wealthy county with what I would call a sort of a strategic county executive and leadership. So there's been support for that kind of thing, but literally a couple counties away, the money is not the same, the leadership is different, and the impact are going to be felt by real people in our community.
Thanks for that, Michael. I'm going to say to the audience, I definitely want to have opportunity for any of your questions. And you can do that in two ways. One, you can put a question in the chat, or you can use or at least on my computer, the React feature to raise your hand if you have a question. I'm going to start with sort of a general question for all of the panelists to speak to, and if there aren't any, you can say that too. Are there any benefits or unexpected positives emerging from this disruption?
Well, the first thing I just wanted to point out, I very much appreciate what Michael and Tanisha shared. So when you see these big disruptions where large sectors or portions of one part of our national government framework changes, it has downstream impacts, which means that there are some things that may not be able to be done at the state and local level that because it's through their funding streams that Abby and the team may not even be collecting right now because that's focusing on federal sector. So there are going to be give and takes in the services that we need to figure out how to handle and how we work with legislators and executives to do that, make those difficult recommendations so that hopefully they can do their role, which is make decisions on behalf of the electorate. That's going to be, I think, one of the greatest challenges that we all have as public administrators. How we articulate that, how we inform those sort of decision making, because it is not going to be fun and it is not going to be easy. But so in talking with the prep, we had talked to Michael and Tanisha about, okay, we can talk about this other stuff, but you need to help people understand the pressures on state and local government because there are far more state and local government employees, far more state and local government programs than there are at the federal level. A lot of what we do is funding. You deal with the day-to-day in many respects.
So true. Michael, it looked like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, historically, there would be block grants, or there'd be, here's a chunk of money, you figure it out. But there was also a bucket full of unfunded mandates. So, we never had I think from a county city perspective, we never had adequate resources to do what the laws were being passed and the policies being passed and what we were being expected to do. There's got to be a silver lining. We're in the shock and awe phase of reacting to this right now. Never waste a budget crisis, right? Is the old mantra. So at some level, yes, maybe we are going to be reassessing. Do we need all those public health services? Do we need as many judges? Do we need the criminal caseload to be reduced? But those are the impacts that are going to happen, right? They aren't all going to be good news for the community. We'll be able to balance our budget, but I think we're going to start seeing more disgruntlement. Does more disgruntlement turn into civic engagement? Does more disgruntlement turn into civic activism and political will? That would be a very optimistic logic model in my mind, but it's possible. Pitchforks are still being sold at hardware stores. They can be carried, in the street. I don't know that that's the civic engagement we're looking for, but I think people are going to get to a breaking point. They're going to see the impacts to themselves. I'm not a politician, just to be clear. I mean, the reason that, to me, the Democrats are fixating on the medical care is that's going to hit people very soon and very immediately and in their pocketbook and when they go see their doctor, or if they can go see their doctor. So that's going to be a very immediate impact. Some of these impacts that, are going to be able to update our bridge infrastructure, not at the same degree. Do people notice that until we close the bridge? They don't. They don't notice that it's gone from a 90 rating to a 70 rating to a 60 rating. Now we have to close it. So, but we're talking about closing bridges in King County, Washington, where we've got Bill Gates and all these other, wealthy people and big companies. The idea of closing a bridge in a rural area is mind-boggling, but that's the reality of the funding situation.
So I see John Paguta's hands up, and I'm going to call on him next. But I just want to ask this question, and it really is a Tanisha and a Michael question. Who gets the blame when the services aren't there at the local level?
We definitely get the blame, right? We get everything because we're closest to the people. There's not my community, we're 70,000, right? Anyone can show up to a council meeting anytime they want and talk to us about whatever they're feeling. And a lot of times, I'm looking at my buddy Tom, a lot of times folks are airing their grievances with the federal government at a city council meeting because they can touch us, they can access us, right? There's no complicated registration process to testify and get called upon. So I can only imagine how that will increase. And as I said in my remarks to your other question, Kim, hopefully not pitchforks, Michael, but I do think this is an opportunity for us to try and engage in better education around these things. The cuts are going to be difficult. The conversations are going to be difficult. What's easy is that there will be bad guys to blame, right? And the politicians will do a good job of pointing out who those folks are. But what that does is knit together some better understanding of how intergovernmental relationships work, of how these things and these services that we've relied upon actually connect to the state as a pass-through or direct from the federal government. And none of us have done a good job of helping our communities to understand where those resources come from.
I would just say it doesn't make me happy to be answering a question about blame, because that seems to be driving a lot of policy. And it upsets me, like at a visceral level, that seems to be the currency, rather than like what's best for our community, what's best for our country. It's about who's the blame going to get pinned on. We put forth a veteran and human services levy, and I understand why we did it, and I think it's a good thing. We're compassionate and we want to support our veterans. But King County didn't create veterans. The federal government created veterans. Why is King County paying the bill for mental health, physical health, housing services for veterans created by the federal government? That's before Trump, right? That has nothing to do with the current administration. That's a structural problem, that the federal government creates veterans for our collective benefit, and I support our veterans, but King County is picking up a lot of the bills for issues that they have when they come back from engagement. So that's a pre-existing considered normal. Now, does every county have a veterans and human services levy? They do not. So are you better off being a veteran in King County? You are, but it's also hard to live here with costs and things like that. So that's just an example where the existing federal relationship, picking up on Vince's comment, like this didn't just happen, right? That was a pre-existing problem of intergovernmental connection and kind of unfunded mandates. We're doing that, and I'm proud that we're doing it, right? Because those people veterans do need help. Not those people, excuse me. Veterans and other people need help, and we're able to provide that. But that's because it's not a uniform service provided across the country. Then the quality of service varies, and the impacts and the negative impacts vary as well.
And Michael, it doesn't help that on the federal level, we have not had authorization bills for agencies or programs, frankly, maybe only one time in the last how many decades. And we have yet to have a regular order budget process where our legislators elected by the people debate what the size of the federal government should be. And you're right, budget is policy. Your budget dictates the policy of any government agency, or frankly, any organization where you put your investments. And that is a deep problem. That's a very deep problem. It makes it hard for all of us who are invested in providing what the public needs to understand where the different roles are, or really plan into the future and make those smart investments to make what we do more effective or more efficient. State and locals, if they don't know what dollars may be coming from them on the federal level, then it helps to figure out, well, do we invest in these sort of programs that may address a program, or frankly, do we invest in technology to make us more efficient if we don't know where those funding streams are coming?
Thank you for that. I see John Poguda had his hand up, so take yourself off mute. Hi, John, how are you?
I'm fine, and this is a great discussion. I want to thank the panel members for some great information and insights. And this is a challenging time. Maybe more than many in my long exposure to public administration. And one of the things, I start looking to, okay, how do we make change? How do we move forward from here? And one of the things that concerns me, and it's different now than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. And that's the amount of misinformation and disinformation, deliberately manipulating the data, providing false information for partisan political reasons. And with the advent of social media, there's so much to wade through. So I'm thinking, Abby, I think your project, the Impact Project, is extremely valuable, and that's going to be some wonderful bits of information and data out there to insert facts. But how do we insert them? How do we combat and move against the flow of this disinformation that is influencing voters, which ultimately that's part of our vehicle for change in a democracy. So any thoughts on, what can we do that we're not already doing to combat, the flow of disinformation and to set the record straight, so to speak?
I'm going to throw that question to all the panelists, and I see Chris. I was going to say, but Chris, do you want to speak to that? And I see Abby took herself off here.
I see Abby as well, and I think maybe what I'll say will feed into maybe what she's going to say as well. But John, I think your point is really well taken, and to Vince's point about the instability of the system for decades. What we are seeing, though, is a new form of politicization, I would say, or a willingness to politicize not only the budget finagling in Congress, but actually using executive authority to do an end around congressional authority to essentially cut federal agencies, but also to target states and localities. If you look at what's being threatened now, both Tanisha and Michael are in red-blue states. There's vulnerability there in a new form that you had not had before. And I would also note that the censorship of language that has also come from some of the executive orders is also affecting our social service delivery providers. We just did a workshop here in the Kansas City metro region, operating in two red states, I would add, but there's severe pressures to moderate and change their delivery of health services, particularly to communities of color. And the absolute prohibition to be able to differentiate services, or at least say they're differentiating services to address the health needs of specific communities, the infant mortality rates of communities of color, for example. There are tremendously impactful, disparate impacts. And I think this is why we need credible, third-party, nonpartisan vehicles for conveying actual impacts.
Yeah.
And so the integrity that I think both Abby's project and our effort are trying to bring is to build institutional integrity, because we can't rely on the federal government right now. We used to be able to say, all right, the labor statistics that are coming out, they may be having their problems, but we know the methods they're using. They've used them for decades, right? We know the pros and cons. Now you can't trust any of it. So the fluency or the fluidity of be able to sort of just make up things to prove a political point, it's called directional correctness. The idea that, and I think Vance actually was quoted in saying this, is when there was the haranguing around the cats and dogs, is as long as the point that we were making is politically correct or directionally correct, what we say to make that point really doesn't matter, because we believe in the value of where we're going. So I just want to make that point, and also get a sense from the other panelists as well about this politicization, a new form of it. And we're also worried here about the rehiring or hiring of federal workers based on loyalty tests and whatnot. And I wonder how that's going to have an effect downstream on the professional integrity of public administration.
Well, my worry is what we're seeing in the federal government will start happening in state and local governments as well. I think legislators have yielded authority to executives. I don't think that is healthy. I think that is a huge problem. And it's happened gradually. Now what we're seeing is the gradualness has been put on steroids the last 6 months, but we've seen this in the federal government for a while. Our states and our localities seeing the same thing. I think that is of great concern. And yes, I mean, I think that the reason we have a non-politicized civil service, given the fact that it was started really when a former president of the United States was shot and assassinated over a job, was that, we have always looked for competent individuals to run programs, irrespective of their political beliefs or their partisan nature. And that has been a strength of government at all levels. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be changes, particularly on the federal sector, to how we manage the civil service. I mean, frankly, I salute the administration's focus on having shorter than 15-page resumes to consider hiring decisions, because that was not an equitable way to attract candidates to apply for jobs. But creating whole new schedules where they're solely going to be political appointees, I don't think that really moves the ball forward. And I worry that what we're doing here is going to be modeled in states. And I worry about those impacts as well. And John is right. Like, the information age and how government has handled that or not handled it is challenging. And the fact that people get their own curated news and information that they want to read and not seeing the other side or understanding the other side doesn't help us.
Can I add one more thought, Kimberly?
Oh,
So
absolutely. Jump right in.
directly to John's point, and also what Michael was talking about what do we do now? I think all of the concerns that Vince and Chris are raising are valid, and the threats to our democracy that we're experiencing, based solely on the level, scope, scale, pace of change, are pretty undeniable. Yes, we can argue about what the policy should be. I think the thing that we have to recognize now is that there is an opportunity in the change that we're experiencing, and that whenever we have a system level change like this, there are vacuums created. Vacuums created for difficult conversations at the local and state level for those who don't have enough in the short term to provide the services that the Fed traditionally has, but also opportunities to be interfacing with communities, communicating directly to communities about what's happening, to leverage those in-groups that we have, John, at a local level to talk about government change, and to rebuild based on community need a way that is more tailored than federal policies have been. So the two opportunities that I see now in this moment of real hardship that I would not have wished on this country is for local communities and local governments to have greater voice in policy rebuilding, and for civic engagement to increase at the local and state level. And with that, locally driven communication about what is happening. And I hope that that can come some distance to combat the disinformation and misinformation, because it's a lot harder to disregard facts when your neighbor is telling them to you than when a federal agency head or a talking head on the news is telling them. So not perfect, not where any of us want to be, but there is opportunity for increased local sovereignty, increased local power, increased local tailoring of services in this moment.
Notwithstanding the threats that Chris talked about for specific communities.
Of course.
Yeah.
Precisely. But this is, Abby, thank you for that. And this is a good segue into my next question, which is just sort of looking ahead. And this is to all of the panelists, what is your hopeful vision for recentering mission, excellence, and trust in public service? I mean, I'm always optimistic, so I just love to have all of the panelists talk about, what would be your vision for recentering mission, excellence, and trust in public service? Because I do think trust has been eroded, and part of it is because of what Chris has said and Vince has said, um, what's factual, where, what's evidence-based, it's really gotten lost in where people get their information that is no longer available from what we used to consider trusted sources. And so, Abby's project becomes so important because she's collecting much of that. So if each of you could speak to that.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and it really is building off of what Abby just espoused about local government, the opportunity at the local level. This is going to sound simple, but I think some of it is that we've gotten away from these simple things. We're focused on leveraging the higher level of trust that we have with our residents at the local level, right? We all know that the level of trust for government erodes the higher it goes. But here locally, we know that our community is relatively satisfied with the services that we provide. They are generally happy with the direction that the city is going in. They believe that they are well governed. They trust our city council and our mayor. That's an opportunity for us that I recently reflected on. We're losing out on. And so we're just going back to the basics of a resident academy. They used to be called citizen academies, or, where you get to really just spend some time. It's kind of hard when you spend the day with the public works guy who's shoveling your leaves and understanding how that all works to walk away hating public service and hating government. But we haven't done, I think there's an opportunity for us to reconnect the community to what we do in government, and to do that at the local level where there's already, I think in some communities, this is not true. So I don't want to pretend. We kind of live in a bubble sometimes in Gaithersburg. But I want to take advantage of that bubble and use that to build on this level of trust that we have to make it even stronger. And hopefully that has some ripple effects through them wanting to understand, learn, and grow and engage at other levels of government and kind of understand how it comes together. So we are focused on that for the spring, just really going back to basics, bringing the community in, and allowing them the opportunity to really engage and learn about how we provide services for them, why, who does it for them, to really make it, as you all said, it's kind of hard to yell at your neighbor about something, right? And in this case, we really are your neighbor providing this service. So that's one of the strategies we're going to undertake here at my city.
Tanisha, that's a great strategy. In DC, we have advisory neighborhood commissions that are elected, nonpartisan roles, basically sub-councils. Basically, if you're an ANC commissioner, you're just one step below being an elected dog catcher. I'm an ANC commissioner here in DC. I'm the chair of my commission. And I agree with you completely. Governance begins when we talk to neighbors like neighbors. So there's a particular issue in our neighborhood that has gotten some people a little uptight over some changes that could happen. And I remind people at every meeting, we're going to listen and respect other positions. That doesn't mean we agree, but you have to spend time listening and knowing the people who are trying to make impacts in your community. You're right. If you're dealing with the DDOT person or the public works person on a day-to-day level, you understand how they're working to try and make our communities better. I think on big government, like federal government, we're not demonstrating that we can do big things anymore. That's why people have lost faith. So for example, with the broadband announcements that went out, I have a place out in the country 67 miles away from DC that benefited from the financial dollars that went to that. But today, 6 days later, there's not one more home that has broadband in that county. And that's where people look at us and say, you can't even get this done. And so I think, again, we need to understand the perceptions. We need to build those relationships at very much the local level. And we need to show that government actually does deliver for the people every day. You just don't see it. And we need to do a better job of helping people understand what that impact really is, starting on the neighborhood level.
I have a humorous response and then a serious one. So I think we should stop going to Marvel movies. I think this fixation on Superman and the Flash and people that can like instantly fix really complicated things is oversimplifying the complexity of our world. So
But
that's just
Michael, you're a superhero. So I mean,
my cape is in the closet. I didn't want to. I didn't want to let you know, but I do. You know, all jocularity aside, here's a quote I want to share in the chat. Trust is built in droplets and lost in buckets. And I'm going to continue on this kind of retail customer service theme that I'm hearing, because you know, I think in one of the trainings I took at some point, you know, they talk about you have a negative customer experience. Could be a restaurant, could be paying your parking ticket, could be something else, it could be with a police officer. You need something like 7 to 12 positive experiences to recoup that bad experience. We don't have that luxury of time, right? We, you know, even if we have a monopoly service, we're the only place you can get your driver's license. You still, you know, you're going to come back with an attitude for the next 6 times until, you know, even if we treat you nice and it works well, the police, the erosion of trust in the police force, you know, across the country. So we're losing trust in big ways. And the way to rebuild it, unfortunately, is at this kind of retail level. It's, you know, it's Tanisha's leaf raker, or, you know, the DOT person filling that pothole. And for the county in particular, this is like, woe me, the county guy, but the city at least delivers a lot of these services directly at the retail level. A lot of the county services, and it's not just in King County, but we have a lot of what I would call wholesale services. So you flush your toilet, everyone has one, everyone uses it. You pay your bill to your local municipality, but they're piping that to King County for sewage treatment. We're kind of invisible to most people. You don't get a bill from us. You don't know that we're there. I guess if you're a neighbor, you know we're there. But, you know, solid waste services, mental health services, public health services, many of these are, well, some of those are more retail level, but we are providing a lot of wholesale services. I rode the bus, and, you know, the bus was late. And the person sitting next to me is like, I'm going to call the mayor and complain about the bus service. I'm like, don't bother. Call the county executive and complain about the bus service. We're running it, you know? So people don't understand the complexity of the intergovernmental system, even at the local retail level. Anyway, I think the role of customer service, it's not going to rebuild trust in the federal government. I think the lack of collaboration and bipartisanship at the federal government has been broken for many years. That absolutely has spillover effects on policy and funding and implications to local government, but local government still gets higher ratings. It gets higher cities get higher ratings than counties, then state, then the feds. So there's a natural decrease in things that are closer to you versus things that are further away. But all of us have to be thinking about that. What's that direct experience of getting your passport, of crossing the border, of, you know, the base, you know, getting on an airplane, right? All those basic things that people are experiencing. Those are all important for us to be thinking about as public servants, and those are establishing trust, that those things work smoothly and efficiently. And, you know, that was even a good experience, right? You know, we're allowed to have good experiences with government. People only talk about the negative ones. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I'll follow up on that, and Michael and Vince, you know, the failure of our government to deliver goods and services is largely due to politics. You know, I don't know the details about your broadband snafus, Vince, but, you know, there's a political signal in there somewhere. If you go abroad and you look at dysfunctional governments that can't deliver basic services to their people, that could be due to professional malfeasance of their career civil servants. That's not the problem we have in the United States. The problem we have in the United States is that we have a political system and political parties that have polarized and led to the polarization of our population and placed the civil service in its crosshairs, and were used as a punching bag of sorts to wage war on based on ideologies. And so I think we've done, I think, too much of where government is broken, we need to fix it, and we need technical fixes to it. We definitely need technical fixes, but we also need to do a better job, I think, as a field to identify where the politics lie and put the finger on it, because the blame is coming to the civil servants, and we need to shift it to actually where it is deserved, which is in the politics. To Kim, your question about vision, right? So we have these triple crises, right? There's the environmental crisis. This is happening at a time where you're having ubiquitous generative AI introduced and being used in every facet of our society now. In a matter of 2 years, right? We've all been on a chatbot. 2 years ago, we didn't even know what they were. And now we're using it in our work, or we're challenged by how we use it. So the transformation is going to happen due to this wave of technology. The crisis of the moment is an opportunity to answer two questions at once. I think the opportunity here is, and my colleague Bill Resch has really got his finger on this, which is how do we improve the efficiency of service delivery using AI in an ethical way? And we need to overlay and consider how do we regulate AI and the use of AI in a democratic context. And so my vision for the current crisis is, and I think part of the challenge, and I think Tanisha mentioned this earlier, we've lost our grounding in civics. We don't even know how governments operate anymore. A lot of this conversation was we need to describe how governments work, how they function, and what the social contract is that we have that binds us together and the history of that. And so I think we need to recapture our tradition. I'm not saying turn a blind eye to the negative parts of the history that we have as a country, but also the instances of where and how we've overcome them. The civil rights movement was moving us towards a more perfect democracy, not a less one. And so we need to engage at the retail level with our colleagues, with our fellow citizens about the underlying meaning of what a democracy means to them and to us, and to find the commonality. And just to underscore, I think that there is an opportunity to connect with people heart to heart, and to remember that the poor consequences of drastic polarization are ugly. They never turn out well for anyone. So I think we need to reinvigorate. I think the field of public administration, I think as educators and as practitioners, I think practicing public administrators have a role to play as civic educators. And I know you do that all the time in educating your constituencies. I think we need to do more of that and centralize a message around this. We need a pro-democracy movement based on some core principles. And so I hope that this crisis of the moment is helping us to determine what it is that matters to us, and mobilizing us as citizens and as civil society to do something about it. And I am optimistic. I do see these forums. I mean, NAP is trying to thread a needle, but they're staging these conversations. I'm excited to be reaching out to members of the administration at the national meeting. I think these are the things that we need to be doing and finding the common ground based on our common values. So we need to be clear on what those are. And I think we have a pretty good sense of it on this line. And I think we need to communicate that.
Chris, that was so well said, and it clearly also points to a big role that NAPA can play in this area. I have time for one final question, and I see Brad Riley wants to ask one, so please take yourself off mute.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you everybody for your comments and your thoughts so far this session. It's been really great. So my question to you is this. In my experience as a city councilor in East Hampton, Massachusetts, I've seen that efficiency and effectiveness of the government are only one side of the coin. I also hear a lot from my residents about the lack of ethics and morality in governance, and how the character of leaders shapes whether the public actually believes in us. So how can we reconcile the need for competent governance with the demand for moral leadership when immorality and unethical leadership is pervasive and is actively eroding trust in government? I know that's a big question, but any thoughts would be helpful. Thank you.
Well, that is a hard question to answer, but I think in government structures, there need to be strong ethical guidelines and boundaries for performance, what can be done, what can't be done. And of course, that's going to differ by community, frankly. Like the federal government, I think, does have some strong boundaries for career civil servants. And if someone is caught, and which is also why we have inspectors general to investigate allegations, when those issues are addressed, yes, the outcome is hopefully that you make sure that that doesn't happen again. But another outcome is people see this and they're pretty disgusted with what they see, and their view of government may shift a little bit. So I think that in education, we need to focus on developing incoming federal employees who understand the basics of ethics and how to apply that in a public sector, and what it means to not take a bag of money and promise jobs to somebody. I mean, there are some pretty clear and simple things. But I think that every legislator like you should be insisting that there are those sort of ethical requirements that is trained on an annual basis in your localities, in your governments. And to Chris's point earlier, there are some, there are some things that we need to fix in the federal government in particular that haven't served the people well. And we get into these things where people view wasted money, which is as much of an ethical quandary, in my opinion, as others. So there's some work that we've got to do in governance, and you bring out a very good point.
Yeah, and I would just add, Brad,
Oh,
thanks
go
for
ahead,
the
Chris.
question. Oh, I'm sorry, Tanisha. I
No,
didn't.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I would just quickly add that we need to develop a roster of legislative priorities to close the loopholes. There's been a variety of norms that have been transgressed and continue to be because it hasn't been written down in law. And so we do need to start that inventory. And I think that's part of what we'll try to build in the ARC is a sense of that, so that we have some legislative priorities coming about when we potentially wake up to the need for drastic reforms in our ethical standards. So I just want to add that we need a legislative agenda to combine with what Vince was saying.
Yeah, and it's challenging, Chris, because you also have a Supreme Court signaling something completely different, right? Where now it's okay to take a bag of cash. So I guess as I watched that happen, in our highest court, and then things trickle all the way down to the local level, I just try to be reminded, and Brad, I think you should talk with your residents about this when they engage you. At the end of the day, the residents still have all the power. And if they throw their hands up in exasperation of, oh my gosh, all elected officials, politicians, or government employees are all corrupt, that's just one, they're abdicating their responsibility and authority and ability, right? They still have the power. And whether that is a recall election that was just mounted in a previous community where I served, and they changed the form of government, and some things that I had warned about have transpired, and they took the action that they could take, which was to mount a recall for the elected official that did not meet their expectations from a moral and ethical leadership perspective. So I think we have to keep reminding we still have the power. We can't walk away from it. We can't just let our disgust, or aggravation with it be the end of the conversation. We have to hold folks accountable, whether that's the local clerk, or higher offices that are elected. So I just want to remind us that we still have that power.
Thanks so much, Tanisha. You will get the last word because we need to it's shocking. We're at the end of an hour and a half. So we need to bring our discussion to a close. So I want to take a moment to thank each of our panelists, Abby, Chris, Vince, Tanisha, and Michael, for sharing your insights, your experiences, and your vision for what comes next in public service. This has been a wide-ranging and thoughtful conversation that has touched on the size and the scope of the current disruptions and the opportunities we have to reimagine governance and sustain a mission-driven workforce even in challenging times. And with that, let me turn it over to Brenna Eisman to close us out.
I'll keep it very, very brief. You echoing the thanks, and Kim, thanks for moderating this discussion. It was a great one for sure. Just thinking about, I know we spent a lot of time thinking about the situation really has felt the last 9 months or so really extreme, and the implications are so significant and often feeling very permanent. But also reform is neither new nor unnecessary. And everyone on this call, I think, agrees that there's ways that things could be done better. I really interestingly, just to hear some of the themes about, this offers new opportunities to identify different operational roles, and just the focus on the local level as a way to gain trust really resonated with me. And as we've been thinking about the work we do at the Academy, that trust is a big component. So thank you to everyone. I know we will come circle back with some synthesis of what we heard today. Make sure that anyone who's interested in some of those links, if you didn't grab them from the chat, for the impact map, for what's going on at ARC, and hopefully we can follow up with another conversation and continue to reimagine. But thank you to everyone.
Thank you.